Hey, Geometry. I'm going to talk to you here about some angle postulates and theorems when it comes to parallel lines in a transversal. Before I get started, I'm going to highlight each of my transversals in a color and each of my parallel lines in another color. You can see I'm doing this on each picture. In each picture, the orange line is my transversal, and the blue lines look to be my parallel lines. Next, we are going to talk about some of these angle postulates and theorems by starting with parallel lines. Each of these postulates and theorems I'm going to talk about right now are going to start with parallel lines. So the parallel lines are what we highlighted in blue. So if we've got parallel lines in our picture, we can start to talk about some angles. For example, we can say that alternate interior angles are congruent. I'm going to mark a pair of alternate interior angles on my picture. There's a couple of alternate interior angles right there. I like to abbreviate alternate interior angles as AI angles. And we're going to add the word theorem to this. So when we start with parallel lines and we conclude that alternate interior angles are congruent, it's called the AI angles theorem. Next up, when we start with parallel lines, we can conclude that same-side interior angles are supplementary. An example of same-side interior angles might be those two angles there. I like to abbreviate same-side interior angles as SSI angles. And again, we're going to add the word theorem to this. So when we start with parallel lines and conclude that same-side interior angles are supplementary, it's called the same-side interior angles theorem, or the SSI angles theorem. Next up, when we start with parallel lines and conclude that corresponding angles are congruent, here are a pair of corresponding angles. This would be called the corresponding angles postulate. I like to abbreviate corresponding with C. And we're going to use the word postulate this time. Next up, when we start with parallel lines, we can conclude that alternate exterior angles are congruent. So here's an example of alternate exterior angles. I like to abbreviate alternate exterior angles as AE angles. And I'm going to add the word theorem to this. So when we start with parallel lines and conclude that alternate exterior angles are congruent, it's called the AE angles theorem. And last but not least, when we start with parallel lines, we can conclude that same-side exterior angles are supplementary. Here's a pair of same-side exterior angles. And so this would be called the SSE for same-side exterior angles theorem. Moving on, if we switch the order of the things that we know for a given problem, for example, if we decide to end with parallel lines, instead of starting with them, we end with parallel lines. We're going to call these postulates and theorems the converse. So, if we started by knowing that alternate interior angles are congruent, and we concluded that lines were parallel, we would call this the converse of the AI angles theorem. Or, if we started by knowing that same side interior angles are supplementary, we could conclude that lines are parallel because of the converse of the same side. Let me do that over. The same side interior angles theorem. Converse of the same side interior angles theorem. To continue, if we started by knowing that corresponding angles are congruent, we could conclude that lines are parallel because of the converse of the corresponding angles postulate. And so I'm going to continue, as I've done, stating the angles first, ending with the parallel lines, and writing either the postulate or the theorem as the converse. So this row, we would start by knowing the alternate exterior angles are congruent. We would finish with the lines being parallel, and it would be the converse of the alternate exterior angles theorem. And last but not least, we could start by knowing that same side exterior angles are supplementary. We could conclude that the lines are parallel, and we would call this the converse of the same side exterior angles theorem.